What is gender and taxation? Is there a relationship between the two? If so, why is it important that we talk about it right now? Now, if you're someone who's interested to learn more about this, then this conversation is for you. Today, I'm joined by two esteemed professionals in this area, Ms. Caroline Othim, a technical specialist on gender and taxation for the Tax for SDGs initiative of UNDP, and our very own resident gender specialist, Ms. Sriyani Perera at UNDP Sri Lanka. I'm Hakshala David, Economist and Innovative Financing Associate at UNDP Sri Lanka, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to the third episode of What the Tax, a UNDP Sri Lanka podcast initiative. Welcome, Caroline. Welcome, Sriyani. Thank you so much for being here. How are you both feeling today?
Quite all right. Excited.
Awesome.
Excited.
Excited, okay. That's good. Thank you so much for making yourselves available to do this. I'm really excited to have you on the show today. We've talked a little bit about gender and taxation during our earlier conversations, and I'm so happy that we are able to do this so that we can communicate the message to a wider audience. Now, gender and taxation, often you don't see it being spoken in the same sentence, right? It doesn't come out very naturally. Now, before we get into the details of it, Sriyani, I'd love to hear from you your views about the gender equality landscape in Sri Lanka from an economic point of view, especially given the current socio-economic challenges that the country at large is facing right now, and what it means for the gender equality landscape in Sri Lanka.
Yes, in my opinion, I think, gender equality is slowly declining in Sri Lanka. The status that we had maybe, let's say, 2 decades before is not the status that we have now. But if you look at the indicators of education, of course, we are quite good because, to tell the least, if we take the university entrance, right? About 54% of, women enter the universities. And also, if you, look at the health status in this country, all health indicators are in favor of women. But what is, not very encouraging is to see how this education is reflected in the labor force. Because for the, last 3 decades, the labor force participation of females is actually fluctuating from 35 to 33%, which is quite low compared to the labor force participation of women. So that in a sense is actually in this kind of a, economic crisis, if such a labor force participation is, reflected here, and then, it actually has an impact on the low income of women, right? And in Sri Lanka, we have 24.5% of female-headed households. So if the income of the women are so low, right, you can imagine, the status of those households. So that way, I think economic-wise, even though women are educated in this country, they are not getting that employment opportunities as we want, right? So it has a damaging impact on their income.
Absolutely.
And also, if you look at the sexual and gender-based violence in the country, right, it's also increasing, and it's now taking a turn to more technology, facilitated GBV, which is also another big issue in the country. So I feel that, gender equality status in this country is sort of declining.
Got it. Okay. On that note, Caroline, can you break down the basics for us? What is the relationship between gender and taxation in your words?
I'll start by talking about what tax means to us, right? So very importantly, tax is an important tool for governments to be able to raise enough resources to fund public services. Public services that at the end of the day would improve the condition of women in the society, looking at funding education, healthcare, and other social sectors. So revenue generating component of tax is quite important. And number two, in relation to gender equality, and to also add to what Sriyani has said around the fact that gender equality has been on the decline in Sri Lanka, is the issue around redistribution. So that is another critical component that tax as a tool can play to reduce the inequalities between different groups of people. So between men and women, between those who have higher incomes and those who have low incomes. And a majority of women are disproportionately higher within the lower income quartile. So tax in itself as a tool can really be leveraged to address the inequalities, including gender inequality. And also holistically, then, gender equality in itself as a fundamental developmental goal is quite important for us to be able to achieve the SDGs as they are. If we were to achieve the SDGs by 2030, then really governments need to take action to achieve gender equality.
Got it. So if I may ask in follow-up to that, is there a gendered difference between the way how this whole tax journey is felt, how it's experienced?
So tax policies and tax systems generally impact on men and women differently. And this really needs to be the starting point. We need to look at how does tax affect, women in terms of their consumption patterns, influencing their behavior. Generally, women tend to buy more household goods, so buying food for the family, buying medicines for children to take care of the well-being of their children. And so looking at the consumption patterns, and for instance, when VAT is levied on these commodities, it gets to impact on women much more because they're the ones who get to purchase the items much more often. On the other hand as well, when you look at women's labor force participation, tax can really play a critical role. One, to incentivize women to get into the workforce. And also on the other hand, for really tax administration to look at providing services that can encourage women to become entrepreneurs. Because as we see it now, there's such a huge gender gap, particularly in the context of Sri Lanka. And I mean, the government can be able to, leverage tax policy and tax administration to try and bridge that gap. And so again, when you look at tax systems and tax policies, the other thing that I would want to highlight is the issue of explicit and implicit, gender biases that are inherent in some of the tax policies that we have. As it is right now, most of the existing tax policies are considered gender neutral, meaning they risk perpetuating gender inequalities and worsening the situation. And therefore, more important would be that the government takes into consideration very robust gender impact assessments before any new tax proposal is put into place or passed into law. On the flip side, to also look at conducting a very detailed review of the existing tax code to determine what are the gender biases therein, and then to put in measures to address this. So the explicit and the implicit nature of tax policies would be very critical for the government to be able to address the.
Got it. Okay. What do you mean by explicit and implicit biases? What's the difference between the two?
Yes. So when you look at explicit gender biases, these are specific provisions within the tax law that specifically references, either gender. Can be a provision that, for instance, when you look at the personal income tax, a provision that would say the unit of taxation is, a couple or a family unit. So inherently saying that the head of the family, which most of the time is the man, would be the primary earner, and then the secondary earner essentially would be the woman. So the effective rate of taxation would essentially be much higher for the woman than what the primary earner would be paying, which in most cases is the man. And on the flip side, when you look at implicit gender biases within the tax policies, these are biases that come about because tax interacts with other externalities. So the gender norms as we see them, the gender stereotypes as we see them, and really at the end of the day it would be, as I said before, for instance, on consumption taxes, it's because of how taxes interact with, some of the behavior patterns that women tend to buy more household goods, tend to take care of their children by getting, health care for them. So really it's in regards to how tax interacts with the externalities for the implicit gender biases. And for explicit, these are very clear-cut provisions touching on either men or women. Increasingly, governments are eliminating explicit biases because you can tell by reading the text, in law that this is an explicit bias, and then, trying to address them. Implicit biases are much more not clearly outlined, so robust studies would need to be undertaken to identify those and then, put in place measures to address.
Got it. That was very helpful. Sriyani, if I may ask you, in terms of, in the context of Sri Lanka, SDG 5, which is on gender equality, where does the trajectory stand right now?
SDG 5, in fact, they say that if we really want to attain, SDG 5, we might need 2 centuries. No, not 2030. If you really look at SDG, let's break it, into smaller sections, right? SDG 5.1, which is about legal frameworks and policies. We are quite good in that, our policies are very gender responsive, and we have a very strong legal framework for, addressing SGBV. But if you really look at the personal laws, with regard to marriage, divorce, and, property rights, we have still very discriminatory laws in Sri Lanka, and it takes so much of time to change those. So that is SDG, 5.1. But if you take the 5.2, which is actually intimate partner violence and non-intimate partner violence, that is all this problematic. It's a very persistent issue. And, the recent studies show that, 1 in every 5 women, right, have gone through this experience, which is a very, very, I think disheartening number. And, so much has been done, though, this issue is taking a lot of turns. As I said earlier also, now it's like the cyberspace is being like, problematic for women, and women are, having problems there, and workplace harassment is there. So SDG 5.2 is a bit of a concern. And if you take SDG 5.3 with regard to harmful practices, in Sri Lanka, we have this early marriage system, and we don't have authentic data on it, of course, right? But, we know that, anecdotal evidences say that, there are a lot of early marriages in this country and teenage pregnancies. So that is SDG 5.3. And 5.4 is also about unpaid care economy, which is also, related to the labor force participation, because many women, they tend to leave work once they are married because, they don't have, family to look after the children, and, they can't balance the work and, life balance is problematic. So, and we are not actually doing sufficient allocations for, the daycare centers. So that prevents women from, being in the workshop. They enter the workforce, but then immediately after marriage, they leave. Most of the professionals do that. So and then lastly, of course, the political participation of women, which is problematic in this country. It never went beyond 5.3. And, decision-making, status and women in politics is always lower than 5.3. And it has an impact on all sectors, if you say, because the policymakers, decision-makers are, mainly male, And there are no, policy decisions. So that's what's happening to the taxation also, If you really look at the tax administration, most of them are males. So with regard to SDG 5, I think, this country needs to, one, maybe do a lot of allocations, right? And ensure there is budget. And also, all agencies, government and non-government and private sector, I think, need to come together as a collective and ensure that we achieve SDG 5.
Okay. Do you want to add to that, Caroline?
Yes, just to add to Sriyani's point, and also, very clearly elaborated, when you look at the UN SDGs dashboard, it provides, this traffic light kind of indication for countries as to where they stand with the SDGs. For Sri Lanka, it's coded red, meaning that the trend indicators are declining or they are not improving at all, right? Therefore, action really needs to happen. And she also raised an important point around gender data. Gender disaggregated data is an important element for any evidence-based policy making, particularly in taxation, but also on the point around women's participation in the space of taxation. Most of the time, tax is considered complex. That this is an expert is, the one who's supposed to look into these issues. So where is the critical voices of women? We need the agency of women to be part of the conversation, to be on the table, to contribute to how these tax policies are designed and formulated. Because if they are not on the table, then probably they're on the menu.
Got it. Yeah. I just want to touch on a very crucial point that the both of you raised, which is the labor force participation. Now, in the context of Sri Lanka, where we have a majority of the labor force represented by the informal sector, most of whom are also women, it exacerbates the vulnerability of women in the sector. Now, what does it mean in the conversation where we bring in taxation into the equation of the women who participate in informal sector workforce? Sriyani, your thoughts on it?
Yeah. If you really look at the informal sector in this country, it's really, important to understand that 52% of our GDP is actually by the informal sector. I mean, it's a pretty large, contribution. And in the informal sector itself, 67% are women. So, it's very unfortunate that this is not acknowledged at least, because women are contributing so much to the informal sector. But if you really look at, I would like to draw a little bit of, differentiation between the formal and informal, right? If you look at the formal sector, where, women are very high in numbers, for example, the apparel sector, right? Which is actually, getting tax rebate and concessions, right? And, they are sort of, looked after in some way, okay? And the tea sector, right? Which is, where we get a lot of women workers. And so if you look, and the migrant workers, because we need a lot of dollars now, and, it's the women who bring in the dollars. In all these three sectors, it's export-oriented, so they are bringing in dollars a lot. And in those sectors, of course, there are some tax concessions, the income of the migrant workers are tax exempted. So likewise, the taxation and informal sector is sort of, looked after, but not the informal sector. Because the informal sector, if you look at, when COVID hit, what happened was the women had to actually leave the micro enterprises. And then when they wanted to get back, the government did not provide any concessions for them. The raw material that is needed, the equipment that is needed for, micro and small enterprises, because of this, cut in imports. So there's a lot of sufferings in these, enterprises. So I feel that if you really want to improve the SME sector in this country, there should be tax concessions with regard to their raw materials, the equipment that they bring in, and also their exports, because, their market many, if you look at the batik industry in this country, right, which is actually a very good industry where women are really, dominating in the industry. But we don't have the proper, the raw material, the equipment. And if we have that, we can do a lot of export. So I feel that government needs to think of giving tax, rebates and concessions, and think twice about the, SME sector.
Caroline, building on what Sriyani said about the formal workforce and the informal workforce. Now, based on your experience, the countries that you've been to, the different tax administration and tax policy frameworks that you've been part of, what steps have tax policymakers and tax administrators taken in order to empower women from an economic empowerment point of view, but also to make sure that tax policies are not gender blind, but gender responsive?
Now, when you look at what governments are doing at the moment, one thing that we have also, raised is that when you look at the care economy, it's often invisible and unrecognized in the formal calculations of a country's GDP. So this is something that we're encouraging governments to, consider taking on board by looking at how tax and fiscal policies can get to recognize and to reduce and redistribute the care burden, so that women, get the opportunity to participate formally within the labor force, but also in the informal sector by providing the rebates, the exemptions and concessions that would incentivize them to be part of the workforce. So very important. But also looking at governments revising their tax code to make them more gender responsive, to really eliminate the implicit and explicit biases therein. So looking at what are the discriminatory clauses in laws, and then, putting in place measures to amend and to make the tax laws to be much more gender responsive. But also, again, looking at, on the flip side of it, the revenue that is generated, is it allocated to, social sectors that would, improve the position and condition of women, in a particular country? So countries are already taking measures. We have a very robust way of looking at how to support countries. So by conducting studies and having conversations around what are the links between tax and gender with public officials, because most of the time this is a new thematic area for them. If you go to a Ministry of Finance, most of the time what you will get is that we treat all our taxpayers equally, right? And that is where the problem is. We need to look at it from a point of view that even though that we are all taxpayers, but tax affects men and women differently. So being able to identify the nuances and addressing those would really be very important. And it being a new area, this really is the critical point, because coming from all this multidimensional crisis, from the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19, we are seeing the climate emergency currently also impacting on women, quite negatively. So how can countries be able to build forward better, to have policies that, we move through in such a just transition, ensuring that they are gender responsive and they respond to the needs of both men and women, and not having them being gender blind as well.
Of course.
Could I add here, to what Caroline said? Because, if you really look at the investors coming to Sri Lanka, we can think of giving them a rebate or maybe some concession if they are actually allowing, women-led enterprises to flourish, right, with their support. For example, if the solar power is actually increasing in this country and we are asking investors to come in, and maybe we can give a tax rebate to those who are supporting the women-led enterprises with solar power energy, right? So that sort of, very specific, interventions could be very useful.
Exactly. And also when you look at the ownership and leadership and employment within the corporate sector, if there are incentives through tax to encourage that, then again, at the end of the day, it will improve, the way women get to participate in that sector.
Absolutely. if we can talk a little bit more about, you've already touched on quite a few recommendations for Sri Lanka. Now, Caroline, if I can start with you, you've done several diagnostics in several countries and also recently in Sri Lanka as well. So what low-hanging fruits do you see for Sri Lanka? Now, Sriyani, for example, touched on the tax rebates for SME, female-led SMEs from an investor point of view. So what are the low-hanging fruits do you see?
So part of the diagnostics that we've done for Sri Lanka really helped us to establish a baseline. So in regards to different elements of the tax system, where does Sri Lanka stand? And definitely one of the areas that Sri Lanka can be able to plug in and to fill in the gap is around, incentivizing women to get into the workforce by providing the concessions and exemptions. But also, on the other hand, looking at the different consumption taxes and considering how they impact women and men differently. Perhaps also providing, incentives in that area, exemptions, but of course doing that with a clear cost-benefit analysis to determine, is this the best, tax policy measure to put in place? So providing these exemptions around consumption taxes would also really incentivize women to, participate actively within this space. The other thing, the other low-hanging fruit is, this is a very pivotal moment because we are seeing so many tax policies, tax proposals being put out, like almost every other day. I think it would be important for the government to consider having an ex-ante gender impact assessment of all these new tax proposals before they are passed into law, so that they consider the impact on gender equality at the design stage and integrate measures to address those before they are passed into.
Absolutely.
Can I have any? Yeah.
Yes.
I was thinking she was talking about the consumption, tax, right? I can remember there was a few study which was talking about, 30% of the population having food insecurity, right? And a lot of malnutrition and, among children and women, right? So in this kind of a context, our VAT, right, might have, a lot of negative, impact on the, household nutrition status, isn't it? So the consumption, taxing has to be rethought of. Now I can remember, there was some kind of a concession on the milk food, right? The infant milk food. So that kind of, measure would really enable a lot of, nutritional, advancement in the household, right? And ease out the burden among the parents. So things like that is possible, I think.
Absolutely. What I gauge from the both of you is that even though from a trajectory point of view, the traffic light is, it's a flashing red, but it's an opportune moment to build on the ongoing tax reforms and to catalyze the low-hanging fruits and see what kind of immediate actions that can be taken to align tax policies with gender equality. So my final question to the both of you, since the both of you are such experts in the topic, you must have your own ideal vision of what a gender-responsive taxation framework would look like. So what does it look like to you? I'd like to hear from the both of you.
Good. For me, what a gender-responsive tax system would look like, number one, this would be a tax system that has, on one hand, gender-responsive tax policies that really respond to gender equality. And number two, really a tax administration that provides administration services that speaks to, women's economic participation, business operators and whatnot. But most importantly, a tax system that is gender responsive is one that would really ensure that both men and women are on an equal footing in regards to taxation. Nice.
Yeah, that's well said. I think, well said. To add to what Caroline said, I feel even sector-wise, there should be some kind of consultation. And also maybe to do some gender impact assessment, as Caroline earlier pointed out, would be very useful if we really want to make our tax system gender responsive, right? So, and also when we are coming out with the tax policies, always have a gender analysis of it before we announce the tax policy. That would be very useful.
Thank you so much for this. This is, I think, a great conversation starter, a lot that we can build on together with the government, the development partners, and the civil society. It's a pleasure having you both on the show, and hopefully we'll meet again soon on another episode. Thank you.
It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On this note, we wrap up the third episode of What the Tax, a UNDP Sri Lanka podcast initiative. I'll see you soon at the next episode. Stay tuned.